So let's talk a little bit about application logic in the sense that we've got this application. Let's say we were tasked to build this. We've got these different users, and we have the ability to select favorite users. So we can end up selecting a favorite user, but there's some limitations where if we end up trying to select more than 3 users, we end up getting this alert, and we have to deselect somebody and select somebody else. Well, this might not be the most complex logic, but we've got a couple of things that are happening in this application. We've got the user interface that we're dealing with, and we've got the business logic that we're dealing with. And they're really, there's a connection between them. But ideally, if we can end up separating out our business logic, we're going to be in better shape because we'll know that the business logic is intact, and then we can end up using that business logic once we end up setting up our UI. So that's the example that I want to do here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a method called, and I'm going to actually call it toggle favorite. And what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to pass some data to this method. Right now this data doesn't end up existing, but what I'm going to do here is let's actually just open this page in a browser. So if we end up calling toggle favorite here, we could end up opening this up. And if I end up opening up my browser, I should see if I end up calling this, let's actually console log it, we'll end up getting back undefined. Well, really what we want to do with this logic is that we're going to pass in some employees here. Again, we'll also try to avoid global variables if we can, and we're also going to pass in the ID of an employee. So let's say that we call toggle favorites, okay? And again, we could call this variable whatever we want to call it, but we're going to call employees, and we'll go over here, and we're going to pass in an ID for the employee. So let's say this is employee 1. What we could end up doing here is that we could find the employee. So we could say employee equals employees.find, and we could say this is going to be where the employee ID is equal to, I see I have a typo up here, the ID that's passed in here. So we're going to pass this in, and here we'll pass in, let's just say we're dealing with Mo as the first employee, and we're just going to go over here and we'll say employee is favorite equals employee is favorite, and we'll negate it. We're toggling the is favorite status, and we'll do this. And so here, let's actually just do it this way. This doesn't have to necessarily return anything, but we'll go over here and let's specify, we'll say console.log employees. So we should end up seeing here, when we pass this through, we could look at this first employee and we'll see that Mo is now the favorite. If we ended up calling this twice, we would see that Mo is not a favorite, being set to false. So how do we end up setting up our business logic here? Well, one of the things we could end up doing is we have some business logic that if we did something like this, so we're going to set Mo to favorite, let's set Larry to favorites, let's set Shep to favorites, and this should be fine. And if we went over here, we would see that all these guys are favorites. I think I've got my IDs mixed up. Shep is 4. So now we've got these 3 employees that are favorites. But we want to avoid a situation where we have 4 favorites. So if I went over here and I did this, we're going to expect this not to end up working. We're going to expect to get some kind of alert that tells us that this won't work. Well, let's see if we can sort of isolate this business logic. One thing we could do is we could go over here and we could find all the favorites. And we could specify employees, and we're going to filter the employees, and we'll specify we are interested in you, employee, if you are a favorite. Right? And for now, we could just console.log the favorites. So if we look at this logic, we'll see that we don't have any favorites. Now we have one favorite, we have two favorites, we have three favorites. And again, we'll have no problem setting this last one here, which is kind of what we're attempting to avoid. So what we could end up doing here is we could set up our logic. Again, this is without necessarily doing any UI, just thinking about this collection of employees and the employee that we're attempting to toggle. And what we could end up doing here is we could end up asking the question. We could say if favorites.length is equal to 3, so we already have 3 favorites, and by the way, Mr. Employee who we're trying to toggle, you're not a favorite. That means we want to make you a favorite, but we can't. Right? So this is the edge case that we're trying to guard against. We've got 3 favorite employees. We have one that we want to modify, but we can't. So what we could end up doing here is we could put an alert. And here we could end up putting in an else. So the idea here is that even without setting up the UI, this would be the business logic of our application, right? We have this data. The data is going to determine the UI. And we want to be careful about changing the data so we don't end up breaking our business rules. So what we should see happen here is that we'll see you already have 3 favorites. And if we go and we look at this, we'll see that we have our 3 favorites here. Again, we could get this to work if we ended up doing this and we ended up toggling. Now this will end up working. But again, if we attempt to add another favorite here, we'll end up getting this message. So again, it's important to sort of think about what your data is of your application and think about how you can end up separating out this logic. Because once I have this logic here, it's really just a question of looping over these employees to end up adding them to the DOM and then showing whether or not they're a favorite, and then putting an event handler on them to end up toggling a favorite. The data ends up changing, and then I could end up re-rendering this data again.